Lara had spent 8 years perfecting her hatred. 8 years watching her father work himself to death on land that used to be theirs. 8 years listening to her mother's lungs slowly fill with fluid because they couldn't afford the medicine that nobles bought without thinking. 8 years knowing exactly who was responsible, the king who'd signed away their lives with a careless stroke of his pen, never bothering to learn the names of the families he was destroying. So when she found him, chained to a tree in the forest, bleeding and desperate, with a sign declaring him a traitor, her first instinct was simple: walk away. Let him die the way her father had died. Let him suffer the way her family had suffered. Justice, finally, within reach. But her dying mother spoke 3 words that changed everything: be better than them. And in that moment, Alara made a choice that would either save her family or destroy them completely. She brought the king back to their miserable cottage. This man who'd stolen everything from them and struck a devil's bargain. His life for her mother's medicine, his crown for their redemption. What she didn't expect was that saving her enemy would reveal a conspiracy so deep it threatened the entire kingdom. What she couldn't have known was that the man who destroyed her family wasn't the monster she'd imagined, but something far more dangerous. A king who'd finally learned to see the faces behind his decrees. Now, with 3 weeks until her mother's death and a ruthless merchant closing in to silence them both, Alara faces an impossible choice. Trust the man who killed her father to keep his promises, or watch everything she loves turn to ash. Because Gerard isn't just hunting a fugitive king, he's protecting a secret that could topple the throne, and the only thing standing between justice and annihilation is a peasant girl who just discovered that sometimes the hardest person to save is the one you've spent your whole life learning to hate. The rope burned against Alara's palms as she hauled another bucket of water from the well, her shoulders screaming in protest. 28 years old, and her body felt like it belonged to a woman twice her age. The pre-dawn air bit at her cheeks, sharp and unforgiving, as it had been every morning for the past 5 years since her father collapsed in this very spot, his heart giving out under the weight of shame and poverty. She could still see the exact place where his body had fallen, a darker patch of earth that no amount of rain could wash clean from her memory. Her hands trembled as she set the bucket down, not from the cold, but from the rage that lived in her bones like a fever that never broke. The physician's words from yesterday echoed in her skull with the persistence of a church bell. 3 weeks, maybe 4 if God is merciful. The cough has reached her lungs. Without the merchant's remedy from the capital, she will drown in her own blood. Alara had asked the price. The number the physician spoke was more than her family would earn in 3 years of breaking their backs in the fields that no longer belonged to them. Fields that had been stolen 8 years ago by royal decree, seized to build a hunting pavilion where fat nobles could slaughter deer for sport while her mother slowly starved. The forest path ahead disappeared into the morning mist, and Alara's boots crunched against frost-hardened ground as she walked toward the boundary. Markers of what used to be her family's land. She needed firewood. Her mother's frail body required constant warmth now, the kind that devoured logs faster than Alara could gather them. The irony tasted like poison in her mouth. They were freezing on land that had once been theirs, land thick with oak and birch, now forbidden to them by a king who had never missed a single meal in his privileged life. The sound reached her before the sight did. A low, ragged breathing that didn't belong to any animal she knew. Alara's spine stiffened, her fingers instinctively reaching for the small knife at her belt. Bandits had been growing bolder in recent months, desperate men who'd lost everything to the same royal greed that had destroyed her family. She moved forward slowly, each step deliberate, her heart hammering against her ribs with a force that made her vision pulse. Then she saw him, a man chained to the ancient oak that marked the old property line. Thick iron shackles bit into his wrists, rust-stained and cruel, the chains wrapped around the massive trunk with deliberate precision. His clothes, though torn and mud-splattered, were finer than anything she'd ever touched. Rich fabric, the kind that cost more than a year of honest labor. His head hung forward, dark hair matted with blood and dirt, and even unconscious, even broken. There was something about the way he was built, the breadth of his shoulders, that spoke of a man who'd never known hunger. But it was the wooden placard nailed to the tree above his head that made Ilara's breath catch in her throat. Crude letters carved deep into the wood. Thief and traitor. She should have turned around, should have pretended she'd seen nothing, let whatever justice or injustice this was play itself out without her involvement. Her mother needed her. The firewood needed gathering. This man, whoever he was, whatever he'd done, was not her concern. Except his face turned slightly as a spasm of pain racked through him, and morning light finally broke through the mist to illuminate his features. Ilara's world tilted sideways. She knew that face. Every person in the kingdom knew that face. It was stamped on the coin she rarely possessed, painted in the church where she'd been forced to pray for his health and prosperity even as her own family crumbled into dust. The square jaw, the distinctive scar along his left cheekbone from some childhood accident the tavern gossips loved to speculate about, the signet ring, still somehow clinging to his finger despite everything else being stripped away. King Aldrich III, anointed ruler of the realm, God's appointed sovereign on earth, or so the priests claimed every Sunday while collecting tithes from people who could barely afford bread. The same king who, 8 years ago, had signed the decree that confiscated her family's ancestral lands. The same king who'd built his hunting pavilion on the graves of her family's dreams, who'd never once looked at the faces of the people his comfort destroyed. The same king whose tax collectors had come 3 years ago, demanding payment her family couldn't possibly make, leaving her mother without money for medicine, without hope, without anything except a daughter burning with impotent fury. And now he was here, chained like a common criminal, helpless, vulnerable, completely at her mercy. Ilara's knife felt heavy in her hand as she took a step closer. His chest rose and fell with labored breaths, each one sounding like it cost him dearly. Dried blood caked the side of his head, and his lips were cracked and bleeding from thirst. He'd been here at least a day, maybe longer, without water, without shelter, without anyone to hear his cries if he'd even had the strength to make them. She could walk away. No one would ever know she'd been here. The king would die slowly, painfully, exactly as her father had died, exactly as her mother was dying right now in their drafty cottage, drowning in her own lungs because royal greed had stolen everything, including the medicine that could save her. Justice, some dark part of her whispered. This is justice. But as she stood there, knife trembling in her hand, King Aldrich's eyes suddenly opened, blue and bloodshot and filled with a terror so human, so raw, that for one disorienting moment he didn't look like a king at all. He looked like a man who knew he was going to die. "Please," he rasped, his voice destroyed by screaming or thirst or both. "Please, I'm innocent." The same words her father had cried when the royal guards came to drag them from their land. The same desperate plea that had meant nothing to anyone with power. Ilara's heart hammered so hard she thought it might crack through her ribs. Her mother had 3 weeks to live without medicine. This man had the power to grant access to anything in the kingdom. But he'd also taken everything from her. Everything. She took another step forward, close enough now to see the hope flickering in his royal eyes, close enough to smell the copper scent of his blood mixing with morning dew. And then, very deliberately, Ilara turned and walked away, leaving her family's destroyer chained to the tree on the land he'd stolen, his desperate pleas following her into the forest like ghosts she'd learned to ignore. The firewood felt heavier than it should have as Ilara stumbled back toward the cottage, her mind a war zone of conflicting thoughts that made her vision blur at the edges. 3 times she dropped the bundle of branches, her fingers refusing to maintain their grip, as if her body was rebelling against the decision her heart had made. Behind her, somewhere in that forest, a king was dying. The king who had killed her father as surely as if he'd driven a blade through his chest. The king whose signature on parchment had transformed her family from landowners into beggars. Her mother's coughing reached her ears before she even opened the cottage door. Wet, rattling sounds that spoke of lungs filling with fluid, of time running out with the efficiency of sand through an hourglass. Ilara pushed through the warped wooden door, the hinges screaming in protest, and the smell hit her immediately. Sickness and decay and the herbal remedies that did nothing except mask the stench of approaching death. "Ilara?" Her mother's voice was barely a whisper, thin as spider silk. "Is that you, sweet girl?" "It's me, Mother." Ilara forced steadiness into her voice as she moved to the pile of blankets that served as her mother's bed. Margaret had been a beautiful woman once, or so the faded portrait in the church suggested. Now she was skeletal, her skin stretched tight over bones that seemed to grow sharper each day. 51 years old, though she looked 70. 8 years of poverty had accomplished what a lifetime of hard work never could. It had broken her completely. "Did you find firewood?" Margaret's eyes, still bright despite everything else, failing, tracked her daughter's movements with the desperate attention of someone who knew their time was measured in days, not years. "Yes." Ilara knelt beside her, arranging the thin blankets with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. "I'll get the fire going. You'll be warm soon." "You're trembling." Margaret's cold fingers found Ilara's wrist, and even that slight touch felt like goodbye. What happened out there? Everything. Nothing. The end of the world and possibly the beginning of something worse. Ilara opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. "How did you tell your dying mother that you'd left a king chained to a tree? That you'd walked away from the one person who might have the power to grant the medicine that could save her life?" "I saw something in the forest," Ilara heard herself say, the words coming from somewhere outside her control. "Something strange." Margaret's grip tightened with surprising strength. "Tell me." So she did. Not everything. Not the part where she'd considered slitting his throat with her knife. Not the part where his desperate plea had sounded exactly like Father's final words. But she told her mother about finding the king, about the chains, about the placard declaring him a traitor. She watched her mother's face carefully, searching for judgment, for guidance, for something to tell her what to do with this impossible situation. Margaret was silent for so long that Ilara thought she'd fallen asleep. But then her mother's eyes opened, sharp and clear in a way they hadn't been for months. "Do you know what your father's last words were?" Margaret asked, her voice carrying a strange strength. "Before his heart gave out on that cursed patch of earth?" Ilara shook her head, throat too tight to speak. She'd been working in the village that day, scrubbing floors for the baker's wife, trying to earn enough copper coins to buy bread. By the time she'd returned, her father was already cold. He said, "Tell Ilara she must be better than them." Margaret's fingers dug into Ilara's wrist now, painful and insistent. He didn't say be like them. He didn't say get revenge. He said be better. The words landed like stones in Ilara's chest. "Mother, that man destroyed us. He sits in his palace eating from golden plates while you're dying because we can't afford medicine. While Father worked himself to death on rented land. While we freeze in winter and starve in summer. He did this to us. Did he know our names?" Margaret's question was quiet, but it cut through Ilara's rage like a blade through cloth. "When he signed that decree, did he see our faces? Did he understand that his hunting pavilion would be built on the bones of families like ours? It doesn't matter if he knew. He should have known. He should have cared enough to know." "You're right." Margaret's hand slid from Ilara's wrist to cup her daughter's face, and Ilara could feel how cold her mother's palm was, how the warmth was already leaving her body, piece by piece. But leaving him there makes you the same as him. Someone who sees suffering and chooses to look away. Ilara pulled back as if burned. "That's not fair. I didn't create his situation. I'm not responsible for whatever put him in those chains." "No, but you're responsible for what you do next." Margaret struggled to sit up, and Ilara automatically moved to help her, hating how light her mother felt, like she was already halfway to becoming a ghost. "He's a man, Ilara, whatever crown he wears, whatever decree he signed. Right now he's just a man dying alone in the forest. And you're a woman who has to look at herself in the mirror every morning. Ask yourself, what reflection do you want to see?" The cottage suddenly felt suffocating, the walls pressing in from all sides. Ilara stood abruptly, pacing the tiny space like a caged animal. You don't understand. If I save him, if I bring him back to the castle, he could help us. He could pay for your medicine. He could give us back what he took. This is our chance, Mother. Our only chance. And that's why you have to do it for the right reasons. Margaret's voice was fading now, exhaustion claiming her. If you save him hoping for reward, you're no different than the nobles who squeeze peasants for taxes. But if you save him because it's right, because you refuse to let cruelty win even when you've been crushed by it, that's when you become the woman your father believed you could be. Ilara wanted to scream. She wanted to overturn the table, to smash the few plates they owned, to rage against the impossible choice being laid at her feet. Save the king because it was right? What about what was right for her mother? What about justice for her father? What about the 8 years of suffering that could be traced directly back to one man's signature on one piece of parchment? But looking at her mother's face, so peaceful despite the pain ravaging her body, Ilara felt something shift inside her chest. Something uncomfortable and sharp and absolutely unbearable. "I hate you for making me do this," she whispered. Margaret smiled, and for just a moment, Ilara could see the beautiful woman from the portrait. "I know, sweet girl, but you'll hate yourself more if you don't." Ilara grabbed her cloak, grabbed a water skin and the last of their bread, grabbed the blanket from her own bed. Her hands moved with mechanical efficiency while her mind screamed in protest. Every step toward the door felt like walking through deep water, resistance building with each movement forward. At the threshold, she paused. "When he's recovered, when he offers reward, I'm going to demand everything we lost. Every acre of land, every coin, every single thing his greed took from us. I'd expect nothing less," Margaret said softly. "Now go, before you change your mind." Ilara walked back into the morning light, back toward the forest, back toward the man who'd destroyed her family. And with every step, she felt the knife of resentment twist deeper into her heart, because she knew her mother was right, knew that leaving him there would make her exactly what she hated most. The king was still alive when she reached the oak tree, but barely. His breathing had become shallow, irregular, the kind of breathing that preceded death. And as Ilara knelt beside him with water and bread she could barely afford, as she prepared to save the life of her family's destroyer, one thought burned through her mind. With absolute clarity, he would pay for this mercy. One way or another, King Aldrich would pay for every single thing he'd taken. The water touched his cracked lips, and King Aldrich's eyes flew open with the desperation of a drowning man breaking the surface. He coughed, choked, tried to pull away from the leather water skin even as his body screamed for the liquid. Ilara held it steady, her face a mask of cold efficiency, letting him drink just enough before pulling it back. Too much, too fast. Would make him sick, and she needed him coherent. Needed him to understand exactly what this mercy was going to cost him. "Slowly," she commanded, her voice carrying none of the compassion her actions might have suggested. "You'll make yourself worse." His eyes focused on her face, confusion and relief warring in those royal blue irises that had never known real fear until now. "You came back." The words scraped out of his throat like gravel. I thought you were going to leave me here." "To die." "I was." Ilara set the water skin down and pulled out the small knife from her belt, watching how his whole body tensed at the sight of the blade. Good. Let him be afraid. Let him understand what it felt like to be powerless. Part of me still wants to. She moved behind the tree, and she could feel his panic radiating like heat from a forge. But instead of cutting his throat, she began working on the chains. The locks were crude, designed more for display than security, and after several minutes of careful manipulation, the first shackle fell away. His wrist was raw underneath, bleeding where the iron had bitten through skin down to muscle. He didn't make a sound, but she saw his jaw clench, saw the tendons in his neck stand out like rope. "Who did this to you?" The question came out before she could stop it, curiosity overriding her desire to remain distant and cold. Aldrich was silent for a long moment, watching her work on the second shackle with an intensity that made her skin prickle. My own advisors, he finally said. Men I trusted with the governance of the realm. Men who apparently decided a dead king served their purposes better than a living one. The second shackle fell away, and he collapsed forward, his body no longer supported by the chains. Ilara caught him instinctively, and the weight of him nearly drove her to her knees. He was tall, easily a head taller than her, and broad across the shoulders in the way of men who trained with swords for sport rather than necessity. She could smell him. Blood and sweat and something else, something that reminded her of the lavender oil her mother used to wear before poverty stripped away such luxuries. Can you walk? She hated how her voice almost sounded concerned. I don't know. But he tried, pushing himself up with trembling arms, his legs shaking like a newborn foal's. He managed 3 steps before his knees buckled, and again Ilara found herself supporting his weight, her shoulder wedged under his arm, every muscle in her body straining to keep them both upright. My cottage isn't far, she heard herself say, each word tasting like betrayal. Betrayal of her father's memory, of her own suffering, of the 8 years of rage she'd carefully cultivated like a garden of poisonous flowers. But if you slow me down, if you make this harder than it needs to be, I swear by everything holy, I will drag you back to that tree and chain you up myself. Something that might have been a laugh wheezed out of him. Understood. They moved through the forest with agonizing slowness, and Ilara became intimately aware of every breath he took, every stumble, every moment where his weight shifted more heavily onto her shoulders. She found herself cataloging details she didn't want to notice. The way his hand gripped her shoulder with careful pressure, trying not to hurt her even in his own agony. The way he murmured sorry each time he stumbled. The way his body radiated heat like a furnace, suggesting fever was already setting in from his wounds. Why did they call you a traitor? The question came out sharper than she intended. The placard, what were you supposedly guilty of? His breathing was labored, each word clearly costing him. Trying to end the war with Valdoria. Trying to negotiate peace instead of continuing to send young men to die for a border dispute that's been raging for 15 years. Apparently peace is treason when there's profit to be made in war. Ilara's steps faltered. The war with Valdoria had taken her cousin 3 years ago, a boy of 17 who'd been conscripted and sent home in pieces 6 months later. You wanted to end the war. I wanted to stop watching mothers bury their sons. There was something raw in his voice now. Something that didn't sound rehearsed or political. I wanted to redirect the gold we spend on siege weapons toward feeding the villages that are starving because we've taxed them into dust to fund battles that serve no one except the merchants who sell us swords and the lords who gain land with each victory. They emerged from the tree line, and Ilara's cottage came into view, looking even more pathetic than usual, with its sagging roof and walls that leaned slightly to the left. She felt shame burn through her. Shame that he would see how his subjects lived, how far they'd fallen, how completely his policies had destroyed them. Then the shame transformed into anger. Good. Let him see. Let him understand exactly what his crown had cost the people who could never afford to refuse paying. Margaret was awake when they stumbled through the door, her eyes going wide at the sight of the king hanging from her daughter's shoulders like a broken puppet. Sweet, merciful God, she breathed. Don't. Ilara cut her off, her voice hard as river stones. Don't say anything kind. Don't offer comfort. He doesn't deserve it. She deposited Aldrich onto the floor near the hearth with less care than she'd show a sack of grain, watching his face contort with pain as his battered body made contact with the hard-packed earth. He didn't complain, didn't demand better treatment or invoke his royal status. He just lay there, breathing raggedly, looking at the cottage's bare walls with an expression Ilara couldn't quite read. This is what your hunting pavilion bought, she said, the words coming out like venom. This is what 8 years of living on the edge of starvation looks like. This is what happens when a king decides his entertainment is worth more than his people's survival. Aldrich's eyes found hers, and she was shocked to see they were wet. What are you talking about? Don't. Ilara's voice shook now, rage and grief tangling together in her throat like thorns. Don't pretend you don't know. 8 years ago, the land confiscation decree, 300 acres of farmland seized from 40 families to build your precious pavilion where you could hunt deer and drink wine while we starved. Understanding dawned across his face like sunrise, followed immediately by horror. The Riverside Decree, he whispered. My father's decree. I was 18 years old, barely crowned 2 months after his death. My advisors brought me documents to sign, dozens of them, said it was all routine governance, all necessary for the realm's prosperity. I never, his voice broke, I never saw the names of the families, never saw where the land was being taken from. They told me it was unused. Crown land being repurposed. Unused? Ilara's laugh was sharp enough to draw blood. My father worked that land for 30 years. His father before him. His father before that. 4 generations of my family poured their lives into that soil, and you signed it away without even reading what you were signing. I was 18, but even as he said it, she could see he knew it wasn't an excuse. I was drowning in responsibility, surrounded by men 3 times my age who'd served my father, who I thought I could trust. I should have read every word, should have questioned, should have seen the faces behind the signatures I was erasing. God forgive me, I should have known. Margaret's hand found Ilara's arm, squeezing gently, but Ilara shook it off. My father died 5 years ago. Worked himself to death on rented land, trying to make enough to survive. His heart gave out in the same spot where our family home used to stand, on land that now grows decorative hedges for your amusement. You understand? You killed him as surely as if you'd driven a sword through his chest. I understand. Aldrich's voice was barely audible. And I'm sorry. Sorry? The word exploded out of Ilara like a physical force. Sorry doesn't bring him back. Sorry doesn't cure my mother's lungs. Sorry doesn't replace the 8 years we've spent in this hovel, freezing in winter and baking in summer, eating scraps and wearing rags while you... Her voice cracked, broke entirely. While I lived in comfort, earned by your suffering. He finished the sentence she couldn't. You're right. Every word you're saying is right. And I have no defense except ignorance, which is perhaps the greatest sin of all for a king. To not know. To not see. To let others show me only what they wanted me to see. The cottage fell into silence, broken only by Margaret's labored breathing and the crackling of the meager fire. Ilara stood there, fists clenched, tears streaming down her face that she didn't bother to wipe. Away. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. He was supposed to be arrogant, dismissive, cruel. He was supposed to confirm every dark thought she'd ever had about the nobility who ground the poor into dust without a second thought. He wasn't supposed to look at her with genuine anguish. Wasn't supposed to apologize like he meant it. Wasn't supposed to make her feel anything except the clean, pure hatred she'd carried for 8 years. The medicine my mother needs, Ilara said finally, her voice scraped raw. Costs more than we'll make in 3 years. You're going to get it for her. Yes. And our land. You're going to return every acre. Yes. And compensation for every year of suffering, every indignity, every... Whatever you ask, Aldrich interrupted quietly. Whatever I have the power to give, it won't be enough. It will never be enough. But it's yours. The fever came for him in the night like a predator that had been circling, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Ilara woke to the sound of incoherent mumbling, her body tensed and alert, before her mind fully understood what had pulled her from sleep. The king lay by the dying embers of the fire, his body racked with violent tremors, sweat soaking through the thin blanket she'd thrown over him with deliberate carelessness hours before. She should have let the fever take him. Should have rolled over and gone back to sleep. Let nature complete what his treacherous advisors had started. But her mother's words echoed in her skull like a church bell she couldn't silence. What reflection do you want to see? So instead, Ilara found herself on her knees beside him, her hand hovering over his forehead before making contact. The heat radiating from his skin was alarming, the kind of fever that could cook a brain if left unchecked. "Mother," she hissed into the darkness, "I need the willow bark. All of it." Margaret stirred from her pile of blankets, her breathing labored even in sleep. "That's all we have left for my cough. I know what it's for." Ilara's voice came out harsher than she intended. The willow bark tea was the only thing that gave her mother any relief from the constant burning in her chest, the only mercy they could still afford. And now she was about to waste it on the man responsible for their poverty. But he's going to die if his fever doesn't break, and a dead king can't get you medicine. The practicality of it settled between them like a stone. Margaret pulled herself up with trembling arms and retrieved the small leather pouch from their pitiful collection of possessions. Her fingers shook as she handed it over, and Ilara could see the resignation in her mother's eyes. Tonight would be a long one for Margaret, every breath a battle without the willow bark's relief. Ilara prepared the tea with savage efficiency, her movements rough and angry as she crushed the bark and added it to the precious hot water from their single pot. The king's mumbling had progressed to full delirious rambling now, fragments of sentences that painted pictures Ilara didn't want to see. "The children's faces," he gasped, his head thrashing against the floor. "I should have seen, should have known their names." "Shut up," Ilara commanded, lifting his head with one hand and pressing the cup to his lips with the other. "Drink this or die. I don't particularly care which." But her hands betrayed her words, gentle despite her fury, careful not to let the hot liquid burn his mouth. He drank in desperate gulps, coughing and sputtering, and she found herself supporting his shoulders, holding him at an angle that made swallowing easier. His weight against her was solid and real, and she hated how aware she was of every point where their bodies made contact. "I tried to stop the war," he mumbled as she lowered him back down. "Marcus said the peace terms were ready. Said we just needed one more week. One more week and the dying would stop." I said shut up, but there was less venom in it now, replaced by something that felt dangerously close to curiosity. "Who's Marcus?" "My brother." The words came out slurred, fever-drunk. "Half-brother. Father's bastard son. Only person in the court I could trust. He helped me see, helped me understand what the advisors were hiding, the real cost of their policies. The villages starving, the families destroyed. God, so many families destroyed." His hand suddenly shot out, fingers wrapping around Ilara's wrist with surprising strength for someone so sick. His eyes, glassy with fever, locked onto hers with desperate intensity. "I'm sorry," he said, and the rawness in his voice made her chest constrict painfully. "I'm so sorry I didn't see you, didn't see any of you. I was a coward hiding behind ignorance, letting others tell me what to think, what to sign, what to ignore. Your father, what was his name?" The question hit her like a physical blow. She tried to pull away, but his grip held firm, insistent. "Why does it matter?" "Because he deserves to be remembered." Aldrich's voice cracked. "Because if I'm going to carry the weight of his death, I should at least know his name. Please, tell me his name." "Thomas." The word came out strangled, and suddenly Ilara was crying, hot tears tracking down her cheeks in the darkness. "Thomas Whitmore, and he was a good man, the best man. He never missed church, never turned away someone hungry, never complained even when everything was being taken from him piece by piece. He just kept working, kept trying, kept believing that if he was good enough, righteous enough, things would get better. And then one day, his heart just stopped. Like his body finally understood what his mind refused to accept. That goodness doesn't matter when the powerful decide to take what you have." Aldrich's eyes closed, but tears leaked from the corners, cutting tracks through the dirt on his face. "Thomas Whitmore," he repeated, like a prayer or a curse. "I will remember. I swear on my crown, on my life, I will remember." "Your crown?" Ilara laughed bitterly, finally wrenching her wrist free from his grip. "You don't have a crown anymore. Your own people chained you to a tree like an animal. You're a king without a kingdom, and all your promises are worth exactly nothing." But even as she said it, she could see the determination hardening in his fever-bright eyes. "Then I'll get it back. Not for myself. God knows I've proven I don't deserve it. But there are things that need to be done. Peace that needs to be made. Wrongs that need to be righted. If I have to crawl through hell itself to reclaim that throne, I will do it. And when I do, your mother will have her medicine. Your family will have their land. Every single family hurt by that decree will have restitution." Pretty words from a dying man. But Alara found herself wanting to believe him, and that wanting felt like betrayal of everything she'd held on to for 8 years. The night stretched on with agonizing slowness. Alara alternated between tending the king's fever and watching her mother struggle for each breath without the relief of willow bark tea. The cottage became a tomb of suffering, 2 people fighting death while she played God, deciding who deserved her limited resources, her limited mercy. Every time she brought cool water to Aldrich's burning skin, she heard her mother's labored breathing behind her. Every time she adjusted Margaret's blankets, she heard the king's delirious apologies. Dawn was still hours away when Aldrich's fever finally broke. His eyes opened, clear and focused, for the first time since the fever had claimed him. He looked at Alara, kneeling beside him with exhaustion carved into every line of her face, and something shifted in his expression. Recognition, maybe, or understanding. "You stayed," he said quietly. "You could have let me die and no one would have blamed you, but you stayed. Don't mistake necessity for compassion," Alara shot back. But the words felt hollow. "I need you alive. That's all this is." "I know." But the way he said it suggested he saw through her defenses, saw the war raging inside her between hatred and something she refused to name. "Thank you anyway." Margaret's coughing fit shattered the moment, violent and wet, the sound of lungs drowning in their own fluid. Alara was at her mother's side in an instant, supporting her shoulders, helping her breathe through the spasm. When it finally subsided, Margaret's lips were flecked with blood, and the sight of it made Alara's stomach drop to her feet. "How long?" Aldrich's question came from directly behind her, and Alara jerked in surprise. He'd managed to pull himself upright, leaning heavily against the wall, his face still pale but determined. "How long does she have without medicine?" 3 weeks, Alara whispered. "Maybe less now." "Then we don't have time to waste." He tried to stand fully and immediately swayed, his legs still too weak to support him. But he didn't fall, didn't give up. "I need to get a message to Marcus. He's the only one I can trust, the only one who knew about my plans for peace. If he's still alive, if he hasn't been caught up in whatever coup is happening at the palace." "And how exactly do you plan to get a message anywhere?" Alara interrupted. "You can barely stand. You have no resources, no guards, no proof of who you are. Even if someone believed you were the king, half the realm apparently wants you dead." Aldrich's jaw set in a line of absolute determination that Alara recognized because she'd seen it in her own mirror every morning for 8 years. The stubborn refusal to surrender even when every rational thought screamed that defeat was inevitable. "There's a man in the village, Gerard the merchant. He served with my father in the border campaigns, saved his life twice. He'll believe me. He'll help." "Gerard?" Alara's blood went cold. "Gerard who owns half the businesses in town. Gerard who bought up our family's confiscated land for a fraction of its worth and built that pavilion you supposedly knew nothing about." The color drained from Aldrich's face. "What?" "Your trusted ally. The man who served your father so loyally, made a fortune from our suffering." Alara's voice was deadly quiet now. "He was first in line when they auctioned off our land, paid the crown a pittance and charged us triple to rent back what used to be ours. So yes, by all means, let's go to Gerard. I'm sure he'll be thrilled to see his investment in your downfall threatened." The revelation about Gerard hit Aldrich like a physical blow, and Alara watched with grim satisfaction as understanding rewrote itself across his features. He sank back against the wall, no longer from physical weakness, but from the weight of betrayal stacking upon betrayal. Every person he'd trusted, every relationship he'd believed solid, was revealing itself to be built on sand and lies and the suffering of people whose names he'd never bothered to learn. Gerard built the pavilion, he repeated, his voice hollow. Gerard profited from the land confiscation. Gerard who held my father as he died, who swore an oath to protect the crown, who stood at my coronation and pledged his loyalty. Profited handsomely, Ilara cut in, each word sharp as broken glass. The pavilion cost the crown almost nothing because Gerard supplied the materials at friendly prices using lumber from our forests and stone from our quarries. He paid you pennies for land worth fortunes, then turned around and rented it back to us at rates that guaranteed we'd never escape debt. He's been bleeding this village dry for 8 years, while probably sending you glowing reports about rural prosperity and grateful peasants. Margaret's voice emerged from her nest of blankets, weak but clear. He was at the market 3 days ago. I heard him talking to the baker about some troubles at the palace. Said it was a shame about the king's unfortunate decisions regarding the war. Said perhaps new leadership was needed for these troubled times. The silence that followed was suffocating. Aldrich's hands clenched into fists, knuckles white with tension, and Ilara could see him working through the implications, like a man solving a puzzle that revealed an increasingly horrifying picture with each piece placed. He knew. Aldrich whispered. When they chained me to that tree, Gerard knew exactly where I was. Probably helped plan the whole thing. Probably. Ilara's laugh was bitter. He owns everything worth owning in this village. Nothing happens here without his knowledge or permission. You were chained on land he controls, on a boundary he patrols with his men to ensure none of us trespass on property that used to be ours. He knew. He knew, and he wanted you to die slowly, publicly, a warning to anyone who might question the new order he's helping to build. Aldrich's face had gone from pale to gray, and for a moment Ilara thought he might vomit. But he swallowed hard, forced himself upright again, despite his body's protests. Then we can't stay here. If Gerard realizes you've taken me, if he finds out I'm alive, he'll kill all of us. Ilara finished flatly. Yes, I'd worked that out myself. She moved to the cottage's single window, peering through the warped glass at the pre-dawn darkness outside. Gerard's men patrol the roads every morning. We have maybe an hour before they pass by here. After that, moving you in. Daylight would be suicide. Then we move now. Aldrich took a step toward the door and his legs nearly buckled. He caught himself on the table, breathing hard, and the look he gave Ilara was equal parts determination and desperation. I can make it. I have to make it. You can barely walk 10 steps without collapsing. But even as Ilara said it, her mind was already racing through possibilities, calculating risks, weighing the impossible against the merely improbable. There's an old route. Cellar about half a mile north, near the original boundary of our family land. It's been abandoned for years, hidden by overgrowth. Gerard's men never patrol that far because there's nothing there worth protecting. Can you get me there? Ilara looked at him. This king who'd destroyed her life through ignorance and was now completely dependent on her for survival. His fine clothes were ruined, his face was bruised and gaunt, his royal bearing had been stripped away by pain and fever, and the brutal reality of his own vulnerability. He looked nothing like the figure on the coins, nothing like the distant ruler she'd spent 8 years hating. He looked human, breakable, real, and that made everything so much worse. Mother can't travel, Ilara said, forcing herself to focus on practical matters rather than the confusing tangle of emotions in her chest. Moving her in her condition would kill her faster than the sickness. She has to stay here. Then she's in danger. Aldrich's voice was urgent. If Gerard suspects she helped me, Gerard thinks my mother is a dying woman with a dutiful daughter caring for her. Ilara's mind was already constructing the lie they'd need to survive. She'll say I went to gather herbs in the forest, that I'm often gone for hours. She knows nothing about kings or conspiracies or treason. She's just a sick woman waiting to die. Gerard won't waste resources on her. Margaret's hand emerged from the blankets. reaching toward Alara with trembling fingers. "Come here, sweet girl." Alara knelt beside her mother, and Margaret pulled her close enough to whisper directly into her ear. "If something happens to me while you're gone, if Gerard comes asking questions and decides I'm a loose thread to cut, promise me you won't blame yourself. Promise me you'll see this through." "Mother, don't." "Promise me." Margaret's grip tightened with surprising strength. "Your father died never knowing if his sacrifice meant anything. Don't let my death be the same. If keeping this king alive means stopping men like Gerard, means preventing other families from being destroyed the way we were destroyed, then it's worth the risk. Make him keep his promises, Alara. Make him remember Thomas Whitmore's name. Make my death mean something." Tears blurred Alara's vision, but she forced them back. Forced herself to nod. Forced herself to accept the unbearable weight her mother was placing on her shoulders. "I promise." They gathered what little they could. Carrie, a water skin, the remaining bread, a blanket, Alara's knife. Aldrich watched the preparations with an expression that suggested he understood exactly what this cost, exactly what Alara was sacrificing by choosing to protect him. When she finally turned to him, ready to leave, he spoke quietly. "If I don't survive this, if Gerard's men find us and finish what they started, I want you to know that meeting you, understanding what my ignorance cost, was worth every moment of suffering that brought me to that tree. You've given me something no courtier ever could. You've given me the truth. Save your pretty speeches for when you're back on your throne." Alara snapped. But the words came out less harsh than she intended. "Right now, focus on putting one foot in front of the other without falling on your royal face." They slipped out into the pre-dawn darkness, Aldrich leaning heavily on Alara's shoulders, their progress agonizingly slow. Every snap of a twig sounded like a trumpet, announcing their location. Every shadow seemed to hide Gerard's men waiting to pounce. Alara's heart hammered against her ribs with such force she thought it might crack through bone, and beside her she could feel Aldrich's body trembling with exhaustion and pain he refused to acknowledge. The forest swallowed them into its depths, and behind them the cottage grew smaller, a fragile shell containing the most precious thing Alara possessed. Her mother, alone, vulnerable, a potential target if Gerard decided to investigate too closely. Every step away felt like abandonment, like betrayal, like choosing a stranger over the woman who'd given her life. But Margaret's words echoed in her mind. "Make my death mean something." They'd been walking for perhaps 20 minutes when Aldrich stumbled badly, nearly taking them both down. Alara caught him, braced him against a tree, and in the growing light of dawn she could see his face had gone pale again, sweat beading on his forehead despite the morning chill. "How much farther?" he managed. "Too far if you keep stopping." But she let him rest anyway, scanning the forest around them for any sign of pursuit. "Tell me about your brother. This Marcus you trust so completely. How do you know he wasn't part of the conspiracy?" Aldrich's jaw tightened. "Because they killed him." The words hung in the air like smoke. Alara's breath caught in her throat. "What?" 3 days before they chained me to that tree, Marcus disappeared from the palace. I received a message saying he'd fled the capital. That evidence suggested he was plotting against me. I didn't believe it. I went looking for him myself, against all advice from my guards. His voice broke slightly. I found him in the river 2 days later. They'd slit his throat and weighted his body with stones, but the rope came loose. He floated to the surface right in front of me, his eyes still open still. Aldrich stopped, swallowed hard. He was trying to protect me, trying to expose Gerard and the other conspirators, and they killed him for it. Something in Alara's chest cracked open at the raw grief in his voice. She'd spent 8 years thinking of this man as nothing but a privileged tyrant, someone incapable of real loss or real pain. But standing here in the forest, watching him struggle with the weight of his brother's murder, she saw something that terrified her more than Gerard's patrols, or her mother's illness, or any of the impossible choices she'd been forced to make. She saw someone worth saving for reasons that had nothing to do with medicine or land or compensation, and that realization felt like standing at the edge of a cliff, knowing the ground was about to give way beneath her feet. The root cellar emerged from the forest floor like a wound in the earth, its entrance half hidden by years of overgrowth and deliberate neglect. Ilara had found it 6 months ago while foraging for mushrooms, a relic from when her family's land extended this far north, when they'd stored winter vegetables in the cool darkness and never imagined a future where even the ground beneath their feet could be stolen. She'd kept it secret, some instinct telling her that hidden places might one day mean the difference between survival and death. That instinct was proving prophetic. Aldrich nearly fell down the stone steps leading underground, his legs finally giving out after the brutal half-mile journey. Ilara caught him again, her own muscles screaming in protest, and together they collapsed onto the dirt floor of the cellar in a tangle of exhausted limbs. For several minutes neither of them moved, their ragged breathing the only sound in the suffocating darkness. "We made it," Aldrich finally gasped, and there was something almost childlike in the relief in his voice. "God help me. I didn't think we would." Ilara forced herself upright, fumbling in the darkness until her hands found the small alcove where she'd hidden supplies during previous visits. A flint, some candle stubs she'd stolen from the church, dried meat she'd been saving for emergencies that never seemed quite dire enough to justify using it. Until now. The flint sparked, the candle caught, and weak light bloomed in the underground chamber, revealing walls of carefully fitted stone and a ceiling reinforced with oak beams that had somehow survived decades of abandonment. Aldrich had managed to prop himself against the far wall, his breathing still labored but steadier than it had been during their journey. In the candlelight, Ilara could see the full extent of the damage done to him. The bruises had deepened to ugly purples and blacks. The cuts on his wrists had reopened during their escape, and there was a hollowness to his cheeks that spoke of days without proper food. But his eyes were alert, focused, and when they met hers there was something in them that made her stomach twist uncomfortably. Gratitude, trust, something that looked dangerously close to admiration. "Don't look at me like that," she said sharply, busying herself with arranging their meager supplies. "I'm not doing this because I've forgiven you. I'm doing this because my mother is dying and you're the only one who can save her." "I know." But his voice was gentle, lacking any defensiveness or hurt. "You've made that abundantly clear. It doesn't make me any less grateful." Ilara thrust a piece of dried meat at him, more forcefully than necessary. "Eat. You need strength if we're going to figure out how to get you back to the capital without Gerard's men finding us first." They ate in silence, and Ilara found herself studying him when she thought he wasn't looking, trying to reconcile the man before her with the monster she'd built in her mind over 8 years of grief and rage. The king who'd signed away her family's future was supposed to be cruel, callous, someone who feasted while his subjects starved and laughed at their suffering. But this man had wept at the sound of her father's name, had apologized with a rawness that couldn't be faked, had mourned his murdered brother with a grief that mirrored her own loss. It would be so much easier if he'd remained a monster. "Tell me about your father," Aldrich said quietly, breaking the silence. "Not how he died, how he lived. Who was Thomas Whitmore when he wasn't being destroyed by my ignorance? Why?" The question came out more as an accusation. "So you can feel worse about yourself? So you can add his memory to your collection of noble guilt?" "No." Aldrich's voice was steady, certain. "So I can remember him as a person, not just a name on a forgotten decree. So when I reclaim my throne and make this right, I'll understand exactly what was taken, what can never be replaced, no matter how much gold I offer or how much land I return." Ilara wanted to refuse, wanted to keep her father's memory locked away in the private chambers of her heart, where this man's regret couldn't touch it. But something in her chest was cracking open. 8 years of grief demanding to be witnessed, to be acknowledged by someone who had the power to actually do something about it. "He taught me to read," she heard herself say. Not just basic words, but real reading, poetry, history, philosophy. He said that poverty might steal our land and our comfort, but it couldn't steal our minds unless we let it. Every night, no matter how exhausted he was from working rented fields that used to be ours, he'd sit with me by candlelight and we'd read together. Her voice caught. The night before he died, we were reading about Alexander the Great. He said that conquering the world meant nothing if you lost your humanity in the process. That real greatness was measured by how you treated people who couldn't fight back. Aldrich's eyes had gone wet again, but he didn't look away. He sounds like a better king than I've ever been. He would have been. The admission cost Alara something, felt like a betrayal of all the years she'd spent nursing her hatred. He would have seen the faces behind the decrees, would have understood that every decision made in a palace echoes in ways that break real people in real villages, would have cared enough to ask questions. Teach me. The words came out urgent, desperate. Teach me to see what he saw. Teach me to be the king he would have been. I know I can't undo the past, can't bring him back or restore the years you lost, but I can try to ensure no other daughter has to. Watch her father die from the weight of my ignorance. Please, help me understand. Alara opened her mouth to refuse, to tell him it wasn't her job to fix his failures or educate him about the consequences of his privilege. But then she thought of her mother's labored breathing, of Gerard's smug satisfaction as he collected rent on stolen land, of all the other families who'd suffered in silence because they had no voice loud enough to reach the palace walls. And she realized that refusing to help him change was just another way of ensuring nothing ever would. My father used to say that a good leader walks among his people, not above them, she said slowly, that you can't govern what you don't understand, and you can't understand what you refuse to see. Every decree you sign should come with a mandatory visit to the places it will affect. Every tax increase should require you to sit in a peasant's cottage and watch them decide which child eats tonight. Every war you wage should start with you looking into the eyes of the mothers whose sons you're sending to die. Aldrich was nodding, and she could see him absorbing every word like a man dying of thirst finally finding water. What else? Surround yourself with people who will tell you the truth, not what you want to hear. My father said that courtiers are like mirrors that only reflect flattering angles. You need people who'll show you the ugly parts too, the failures and mistakes and consequences you'd rather not see. Like you. There was something raw in his voice. You've shown me more truth in 2 days than my entire court has in years. Because I have nothing to lose, Alara shot back. Because you've already taken everything that mattered. That's the problem with being powerful. Everyone around you has something to lose by angering you, so they smile and agree and tell you comfortable lies. You need people in your council who can't be bought or threatened or flattered into silence. They talked deep into the morning, and Alara found herself sharing things she'd never spoken aloud. The humiliation of begging for work from people who used to be her family's tenants. The shame of wearing clothes with patches on patches while Gerard's wife paraded through town in silk dresses paid for with stolen profits. The soul-crushing mathematics of poverty, where a single copper coin could mean the difference between eating or freezing, and every choice was really just choosing which form of suffering to endure. And Aldrich listened, really listened, asked questions that proved he was trying to understand, not just waiting for his turn to speak. Admitted when he didn't comprehend something, when his privileged upbringing had left blind spots in his understanding. Took notes in the dirt with a stick, sketching out ideas for reforms, for changes, for ways to ensure what happened to her family never happened again. There should be a council, he said, his voice gaining strength and conviction. Representatives from every region, chosen by the common people, not appointed by nobility. They'd have real power to challenge decrees, to demand accountability, to force people like me to see the consequences of our decisions before they become policy. Gerard would fight that with everything he has, Alara pointed out. Every noble who's profited from the current system would see it as a threat. You'd be declaring war on your own class. Good. And the steel in Aldrich's voice reminded Alara that underneath the guilt and grief, this was still a man who'd been raised to rule. Let them fight. Let them reveal themselves. Marcus used to say that corruption thrives in darkness and dies in sunlight. Time to throw open all the windows and let people see exactly how rotten the foundation has become. A sound from above froze them both. Footsteps, multiple sets, moving through the forest with the deliberate pattern of a search party. Ilara's hand flew to her knife as she moved to the cellar entrance, pressing herself against the stone wall, listening. Voices filtered down, muffled but clear enough to make her blood run cold. Said the girl comes out here sometimes, herb gathering or some such. Gerard's voice, unmistakable in its cultured arrogance. If she's hiding something, this is where she'd do it. Want us to check the old cellars? Another voice, younger, eager to please. All of them. Every structure within a mile of the boundary. The king's body. Should have been found by now. Either he's dead and animals dragged him off, or someone helped him. And in this village, there's only one person stupid enough or desperate enough to risk harboring a traitor. Ilara's eyes met Aldrich's across the cellar, and in that moment they both understood with perfect clarity that they'd run out of time. Ilara's mind raced through possibilities with the frantic speed of a cornered animal searching for escape. The cellar had only one entrance, the stone steps. They'd descended just hours ago. No back exit, no hidden tunnel, no miracle salvation waiting in the shadows. Above them, Gerard's men were spreading out through the forest, their boots crushing fallen leaves with sounds that grew steadily closer. In minutes, maybe seconds, someone would spot the overgrown entrance, would investigate, would find a king and a peasant girl trapped underground with nowhere to run. Aldrich pushed himself upright, his jaw set with grim determination despite the way. His body swayed with exhaustion. If they find us together, they'll kill you too, he whispered urgently. Tell them I forced you to help me. Tell them I threatened your mother. They might believe. Shut up. Ilara's voice was sharp as she pressed herself against the wall beside the entrance, knife gripped in her hand with white-knuckled intensity. Her mind was working through scenarios, discarding options as quickly as they formed. They couldn't fight their way out. She had a kitchen knife and Aldrich could barely stand. They couldn't hide. The cellar was small, empty of anything large enough to conceal a grown man. They couldn't talk their way out. Gerard wanted Aldrich dead and wouldn't hesitate to kill any witnesses. Which left exactly one option, so desperate and dangerous that even considering it felt like madness. Can you act? The question came out barely louder than breath. Aldrich's eyes narrowed in confusion. What? Can you act like you're dying? Like you're already more corpse than man? Ilara's hands were trembling as she worked through the plan forming in her mind, each piece clicking into place with the terrible clarity of someone who understood they were gambling everything on a single desperate bluff. Because I have an idea, and if it fails, we're both dead. But if you can't sell it, if you hesitate even for a second, tell me what to do. No hesitation, no questions. Just immediate trust that made something in Ilara's chest twist painfully. The footsteps were closer now, perhaps 30 feet away. Ilara could hear branches snapping, men calling to each other as they searched. She grabbed the candle and tilted it, letting hot wax drip onto Aldrich's face and exposed skin, creating blisters that looked like infection. He flinched, but didn't make a sound as she worked, his teeth clenched against the pain. She tore at his already ruined clothes, making the damage look worse, more violent, grabbed dirt from the floor and rubbed it into his wounds until they looked septic, festering. When they come down, you're unconscious, she hissed, barely breathing, fever hot, dying from infected wounds. I found you yesterday, tried to help because I'm a stupid girl who doesn't understand politics or treason. I thought if I saved your life, you'd reward my family. But you're too far gone. The infection has you. You have hours at most. Understand? Aldrich nodded once, sharp and certain, then let his body go slack against the wall. His eyes rolled back slightly, his breathing became shallow and erratic, and the transformation was so complete that for one terrifying moment, Ilara actually believed he was dying. She forced herself to look away, to focus on the entrance, on the lie she was about to tell that would either save them or condemn them both. The footsteps stopped directly above the cellar. "Here, I found something." A young man's voice, excited and eager. "Looks like an old entrance. Mostly hidden, but there's fresh disturbance in the undergrowth." "Check it," Gerard's voice commanding and cold. "Carefully. If she's down there, she might be armed." Ilara made her decision in the space between heartbeats. She dropped her knife, letting it clatter obviously against the stone floor. Then she started screaming. "Help, please, someone help! He's dying, I don't know what to do!" The effect was immediate. Boots thundered down the stone steps, and suddenly the cellar was full of armed men, torches blazing, swords drawn. They surrounded her in seconds, and Ilara let herself collapse to her knees. Let tears stream down her face, let her voice break with very real terror as she looked up at them with wide, desperate eyes. "Thank God you're here," she gasped. "I found him yesterday, chained to a tree. I didn't know who he was at first, just that he was hurt. I thought if I helped him, he might reward me. My mother's dying, and we need medicine, and I was so desperate." She let her voice dissolve into sobs. "But he's too sick. The wounds are infected. He keeps calling out for someone named Marcus. I think he's delirious." I didn't know what else to do. Gerard himself descended the steps, his fine clothes somehow remaining immaculate despite the forest journey. He was a large man, well-fed in a way that spoke of never missing meals while others starved, with cold eyes that evaluated everything in terms of profit and loss. Those eyes swept over the cellar, taking in Aldrich's apparently unconscious form, Ilara's tear-stained face, the pathetic collection of supplies scattered across the dirt floor. "How long has he been like this?" Gerard's voice was deceptively gentle, the tone of someone who knew how to extract information from frightened peasants. "Since last night." Ilara forced herself to meet his eyes, to hold his gaze despite every instinct screaming at her to look away. "The fever got worse. He stopped making sense. I gave him water, but he can barely swallow. I think he's going to die. And now I've wasted everything trying to save him and my mother." She broke off into fresh sobs that weren't entirely manufactured. The terror was real. The stakes were real. If Gerard saw through this performance, her mother would die alone, and Ilara would follow shortly after. Gerard moved closer to Aldrich, and Ilara's heart hammered so hard she thought everyone in the cellar must be able to hear it. He crouched beside the king's body, studying his face with clinical detachment. Reached out and pressed 2 fingers against Aldrich's throat, checking for a pulse. Ilara held her breath, praying that Aldrich could control his body enough to seem barely alive, that the racing heartbeat she knew he must have wouldn't give them away. "He's burning up," Gerard announced, and there was something in his voice that might have been satisfaction. "Infection in the blood. You're right, girl. He's dying." He stood, brushing dirt from his fine trousers with casual disdain. "Pity. Would have been cleaner to finish him properly. But this works too. Nature doing what we started. What should I do?" Ilara forced confusion into her voice, let herself sound young and stupid and desperate. "Should I keep trying to help him? Will there be a reward if he survives?" Gerard's laugh was cruel. "Survive? Child, look at him. He'll be dead by nightfall. And when he dies, you're going to bury him deep in this cellar and never speak of it to anyone. Do you understand? This king, this traitor, was never here. You never found him. This conversation never happened. But my mother, the medicine she needs. You thought wrong." Gerard's voice went hard as iron. "Your mother is dying, and there's nothing to be done about it. Accept it. Move on. And if you ever mention finding anyone in this forest, if you ever speak one word about what happened here, I'll make sure you join her in the ground. Do we have an understanding?" Ilara let her shoulders slump in. Defeat let hopelessness wash over her features. "Yes, sir, I understand." "Good girl." Gerard patted her head like she was a dog, the gesture so condescending that Ilara had to bite her tongue until she tasted blood to keep from spitting in his face. "Come on, men. Let the king die in peace, or pieces. Either way, our problem solves itself." They filed back up the steps, their torches retreating, their voices fading. Ilara remained on her knees, body shaking, not daring to move until the last footstep disappeared into the forest. Then she waited longer, counting her own heartbeats, making absolutely certain they were gone before she finally let herself breathe again. "Are they gone?" Aldrich's whisper was so quiet she almost missed it. "I think so." Ilara crawled to the entrance, peering up into the forest. Empty, silent except for birdsong. She sagged against the stone wall, her whole body trembling with the aftermath of terror and adrenaline. "God help me, I think it worked." Aldrich slowly opened his eyes, and the look he gave her was something beyond gratitude, beyond admiration, something that made Ilara's breath catch for reasons that had nothing to do with fear. "That was the most incredible thing I've ever witnessed. You saved both our lives with nothing but words and acting. You would have made a formidable queen." "Don't." The word came out sharper than she intended. "Don't say things like that. This isn't a fairy tale. You're still the king who destroyed my family. I'm still a desperate girl trying to save her dying mother. Nothing about this situation is romantic or noble or anything except survival." But even as she said it, she could feel something shifting between them, some barrier she'd carefully constructed crumbling despite her best efforts to maintain it. Because he'd trusted her completely, put his life in her hands without hesitation. Because she'd protected him with the same ferocity she'd protect her own mother. Because somewhere in the past, 2 days, he'd stopped being a symbol of everything she hated and started being a person she was terrified to care about. Gerard said nightfall, Aldrich said quietly, pulling himself back to sitting position. "Which means we have until tonight before he expects me to be dead. After that, he'll send someone to check, to make sure the problem is buried. We need to be far away from here by then. We need to get you to the capital, to whoever's left that you can trust." Ilara's mind was already moving forward, planning, calculating. "But we can't use the main roads. Gerard's men will be watching, and we can't go back to my cottage. My mother," her voice cracked. "I have to warn her, have to get her somewhere safe before Gerard realizes she's a loose end. Then we go tonight." Aldrich's voice carried the weight of command now, the king reasserting himself through the mask of the dying man. "Under cover of darkness. We get your mother. We head north to the river. I have allies 3 days' journey from here, soldiers who served with Marcus, who knew about the peace negotiations. If we can reach them, 3 days?" Ilara's laugh was half hysterical. "You can barely walk 3 steps. My mother can't leave her bed without coughing blood. And you think we can travel 3 days through hostile territory with Gerard's men hunting us? Do we have another choice?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Because they both knew the answer. They had no choice, no other options, no miracle waiting to save them. Just desperate flight and impossible odds, and the thin hope that somehow, against all logic, they might survive long enough to make any of this matter. The cottage was dark when they finally reached it, moving through the forest like ghosts as twilight bled into night. Ilara's heart had been in her throat the entire journey back, every shadow a potential threat, every sound a harbinger of Gerard's men discovering their deception. But the windows remained empty of watchers, the door undisturbed, and for one desperate moment she let herself believe they might actually make it out alive. That hope shattered the instant she pushed open the door. Her mother's bed was empty, the blankets thrown aside, the small collection of possessions disturbed, and there on the crude wooden table sat a piece of parchment weighted down with a stone. Ilara's hands trembled as she reached for it, and even before she read the words, she knew with sick certainty that everything was about to get worse. The note was written in Gerard's elegant script, each letter perfectly formed, the message delivered with the casual cruelty of someone who held all the power and knew it. "Dear Ilara, I've taken your mother to my estate for proper care. Her condition worsened significantly this afternoon, and as a pillar of this community, I felt obligated to ensure she receives the medical attention befitting all my tenants. Please join us at your earliest convenience so we might discuss the terms of her continued treatment. I'm certain we can reach an arrangement that benefits everyone involved. Signed, Gerard." The parchment crumpled in Alara's fist as rage and terror warred for dominance in her chest. "He knows," she whispered, her voice hollow. "He knows we lied. He's taken her as leverage." Aldrich moved to her side, reading the note over her shoulder, and she could feel the tension radiating from his body like heat from a forge. "This is my fault. I should have anticipated, should have realized he wouldn't just walk away without insurance." "Your fault?" Alara's laugh was sharp enough to draw blood. "Everything is your fault. My father's death, my mother's illness, Gerard's power, all of it traces back to you and your inability to see past your own privileged blindness. And now she's going to die because I made the mistake of trying to save you instead of letting you rot on that tree where you belonged." The words hit like physical blows, and she watched Aldrich absorb each one without flinching, without defending himself. Because he knew she was right. Because every accusation she hurled at him was justified by 8 years of suffering that could have been prevented if he'd cared enough to look beyond his palace walls. "You're right," he said quietly, "about all of it. But hating me won't save your mother, and destroying me won't undo the past. So we can stand here trading blame and drowning in what should have been, or we can figure out how to get her back." Alara wanted to hit him, wanted to drive her knife into his chest and watch him bleed out on the floor of the cottage his decree had condemned her family to. Wanted to make him hurt the way she'd been hurting for 8 endless years. But her mother was alive, held hostage in Gerard's estate, and rage was a luxury she couldn't afford. "He's expecting me to come alone," she said, forcing her mind to work through the implications. "Expecting me to beg for her life, to offer myself in exchange, to give him whatever leverage he wants over the king. Which means he doesn't know you're here with me. Still thinks you're dying in that cellar. Then we use that." Aldrich's voice carried the weight of command again, the strategist emerging through the guilt-ridden man. "He's made a mistake, shown his hand too early. If he thinks I'm helpless and you're desperate, he'll be confident, overconfident, and confident men make errors. What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting we give Gerard exactly what he expects. You go to his estate, play the terrified daughter willing to do anything to save her mother. Keep him distracted, keep his attention on you. While you're doing that, I get inside and find your mother." Alara stared at him like he'd lost his mind. "You can barely walk without support. You have no weapons, no authority, no way to even prove who you are. You think you're just going to stroll into Gerard's estate and rescue my mother while his guards stand around watching? No." And there was something in Aldrich's eyes now that reminded Alara he'd been raised from birth to rule, to command, to make impossible decisions under pressure. "I'm going to use the one advantage Gerard doesn't know I have. I know his estate. Know the layout, the security, the blind spots in his defenses. Because 8 years ago, when my father was still alive, Gerard hosted a royal hunt on those grounds. I spent 3 days there, and I remember. 8 years. Ago, you were barely more than a boy. How can you possibly remember?" "Because I pay attention to details, even when I should have been paying attention to people." There was no pride in the admission, only grim self-awareness. "I can tell you which windows have iron bars and which have wooden shutters, where the guards patrol and when they change shifts, which doors are kept locked and which are left open for servants. I memorized it all because my tutors taught me that knowledge of terrain was the difference between victory and defeat. I just never realized the real battle was for the hearts of my people, not the security of their estates." Alara wanted to argue, to tell him the plan was suicide, that she'd already lost her father and couldn't bear losing her mother too. But looking at his face in the dim light filtering through the cottage windows, she saw something she'd never expected to see in a king. Not arrogance or certainty or divine right, but determination born of genuine desperation, the kind that comes from understanding you've failed catastrophically, and this might be your only chance at redemption. "If you're wrong," she said quietly, "if you get caught, if this fails, Gerard will kill you both. My mother and the king of the realm, dead because of my choice to trust you. Then don't trust me." Aldrich's hand found hers in the darkness, his grip warm and solid and absolutely certain. "Trust yourself. Trust your ability to keep Gerard distracted, to play the role you played so perfectly in that cellar. Trust that you're strong enough and clever enough to give me the time I need. Because I've learned something in the past 2 days that all my tutors and advisors never taught me. Real strength isn't about crowns or armies or royal blood. It's about people like you, who survive impossible circumstances and still find the courage to save someone who doesn't deserve saving. Alara's throat went tight, tears threatening to spill over, because she'd spent 8 years believing all nobility was corrupt, all power was poison, all kings were tyrants who feasted on the suffering of their subjects. But this man, this impossible, frustrating, complicated man, was making her question everything she thought she knew about justice and mercy, and whether people could change when given the chance. "My father would have liked you," she whispered. "The you that you're becoming anyway. Not the boy who signed away our lives without reading the decree, but the man who's willing to risk everything to make it right. Then help me be worthy of that. Help me become the king Thomas Whitmore deserved." Aldrich pulled her closer, and in the intimate darkness of the cottage, she could see every emotion warring across his face, determination and fear and something that looked dangerously like hope. "Help me save your mother, stop Gerard, and build a kingdom where no other family has to suffer the way yours has. Please, Alara, give me this chance." She should have said no. Should have recognized this for the manipulation it might be. Pretty words from a practiced politician designed to make her complicit in her own destruction. Should have protected herself the way she'd learned to protect herself after 8 years of being ground into dust by people who viewed peasants as resources to be exploited rather than people to be valued. But when she looked into his eyes, all she saw was a man who'd been stripped of everything: crown, dignity, certainty, and was still trying to do the right thing. Not because it served him, not because it was politically expedient, but because he'd finally, devastatingly, learned to see the cost of his blindness. "One chance," she said, her voice steady despite the terror flooding her veins. "You get one chance to prove you're more than the boy who destroyed my family. One chance to show me that kings can be better than the system that created them. Fail, and I swear on my father's grave I'll tell everyone who will listen exactly what kind of ruler you really are." "Fair enough." And the small smile that crossed his face was sad and knowing and achingly human. "Though if I fail, I'll probably be too dead to care about my reputation." They prepared in grim silence, each understanding that this might be the last conversation they ever had. Alara changed into her least ragged dress, the one she saved for church, making herself look young and frightened and desperate. Aldrich scavenged clothing from her father's old trunk, garments that had hung unused for 5 years but still carried Thomas Whitmore's scent. The irony wasn't lost on either of them, the king wearing a dead man's clothes to rescue the widow of his own failed policies. At the door, Alara paused, turned back. "If something happens to me, if Gerard realizes what we're doing and I can't..." Her voice cracked. "Tell my mother I'm sorry. Tell her I tried to be better, the way Father wanted. Tell her yourself." Aldrich's voice was fierce, with conviction. "When we're all safe and Gerard is in chains, and your mother is finally receiving the medicine she should have had access to 8 years ago, you'll tell her yourself, and I'll be there to witness it. And together we'll start building the kingdom she and your father deserve to live in." Alara nodded, not trusting herself to speak, and stepped out into the night. Behind her, she could feel Aldrich watching until she disappeared into the darkness. 2 desperate people gambling. Everything on a plan that had 1,000 ways to fail and exactly 1 narrow path to success. The walk to Gerard's estate felt like walking to her own execution, each step taking her closer to a confrontation that would determine not just her mother's fate, but the future of an entire kingdom. And somewhere in the darkness behind her, a broken king who'd finally learned to see was preparing to risk everything for a family he'd destroyed, a woman he barely knew, and a chance at redemption that might cost him his life. The gates of Gerard's estate loomed ahead, torches blazing, guards standing watch, and Alara forced her shoulders back, her chin up, and walked forward like a woman who had nothing left to lose. because she didn't, and that made her more dangerous than any army. In the end, Alara's story forces us to confront the most uncomfortable truth about justice and mercy, that sometimes the right choice is the one that costs us everything we thought we wanted. She could have walked away from that tree, and no one would have blamed her. She could have let the king die and called it justice for 8 years of suffering, for her father's broken heart, for her mother's drowning lungs. But she chose something harder than revenge. She chose to see the humanity in her enemy, to offer mercy when cruelty would have been easier, to build a bridge across an ocean of pain that separated the powerful from the powerless. And in doing so, she didn't just save a king, she revealed what true strength really looks like. Not the strength to destroy those who've hurt us, but the strength to remain human even when the world has given us every reason to become monsters. So ask yourself this: if you found the person responsible for your deepest suffering completely at your mercy, what would you choose? Would you have the courage to be better than your pain? Or would you let years of justified rage make the decision for you? Could you look past the crown or the title or the signature on the decree and see just a flawed human being capable of change? These aren't easy questions, and there are no perfect answers. But that's what makes Alara's choice so powerful. She didn't choose perfectly. She chose bravely. She chose to believe that people can learn, that systems can change, that the cycle of suffering doesn't have to continue just because it's always been that way. She chose hope when despair would have been so much simpler. If this story moved you, if it made you think about mercy and justice in ways you hadn't considered before, then share it with someone who needs to hear it. Hit that like button if you believe, like Alara did, that we can be better than our worst moments. And subscribe to this channel because stories like these, stories that challenge us, that make us uncomfortable, that force us to examine who we are and who we want to become, these are the stories that change us. These are the stories that remind us what it means to be human. Thank you for listening, and remember, the hardest person to forgive might just be the one who teaches you the most about yourself.